Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks, are people who are married better off? Right? We see this research that indicates that people who are married, compared to those who are unmarried, enjoy more mental and physical health benefits, they have financial advantages, they're happier, have a sense of purpose, as well as a number of other advantages. Now, recently, I did a video on the men going their own way philosophy, MGTOW, as it's called, MGTOW. And I saw a lot of different opinions expressed there, and of course they were on a continuum. Now, some of the comments expressed what many people would consider fairly extreme views, but a number of comments really just said, look, this idea of MGTOW is simply a choice not to get involved with women. Of course, MGTOW is a group of men. So it's men who choose to avoid relationships. And I actually received a number of questions from women who've made the same choice. Of course, it's not called MGTOW, it's just women who don't want to be in relationships. So both groups kind of taking this stance of this is simply a choice to avoid romantic involvement, and of course that would include marriage, ask questions about the benefits of marriage. Again, are people who are married really better off? Can it be simply a rational choice to not get involved in a marriage or a romantic relationship of any type? So I suppose one interesting thing here is the idea that marriage is romantic, right? We assume that when people get married, we assume that they're in love and it has a romantic quality to it, but it doesn't necessarily have to. But I would agree there's a lot of overlap there. So if someone's married, they usually do consider that to be an expression of romance, at least at some level. So either way, that essentially leads me to the question about the rationality of marriage and does it make sense to be married? Now, of course, there are other ways to have relationships other than marriage, but the reason I'm focusing more on marriage than cohabitation and dating is because we have a lot of research available on marriage that goes back a long way, including some longitudinal studies. So it really gives us kind of a good idea of the potential benefits and downsides to marriage. The research is a little more solid for that construct than constructs we see kind of more recently appearing in the research literature. So if we take a look at the statistics behind marriage and the statistics for those who are unmarried, we see that 45% of U.S. residents 18 and older are unmarried. And if we look at this by gender, 53% of women in this category are unmarried and 46% of males are unmarried. So we know that there are 88 unmarried men for every 100 unmarried women. So if I break down this category, this unmarried category, we see that about 64% of individuals have never been married, 23% are divorced, and 13% are widowed. So if we take a look at the research literature, we see that men and women who are married are generally happier and healthier than those who are not married. Now, there are some studies that kind of show different results, and I'll talk about these results, but in general, if we look at all the literature, this is the tendency that we see. And the reasons would be that there's more of a sense of purpose and meaning, more social integration, more support as compared to being unmarried, and the ability to share economic resources. So specifically looking at the mental health benefits, it does appear that only people in higher quality marriages tend to benefit in terms of their mental health. So individuals in low quality marriages have mental health symptoms that are usually worse than if they were unmarried. Now, this construct of the level of quality of a marriage is actually fairly important. We see that when people are in a low quality marriage and they get divorced, they tend to have increased life satisfaction. But if they get divorced and they were in a high quality marriage, life satisfaction tends to decrease. And this effect is actually more pronounced for women than men. So women who are in a low quality marriage and get divorced tend to have markedly increased life satisfaction. And women who are in a higher quality marriage and get divorced tend to have markedly lower life satisfaction. Now, another element we see in the research that's kind of important is this idea of people who are unhappily married. So one of the arguments you could make here in terms of avoiding relationships is that people who stay in relationships that are not happy in those relationships have negative consequences from that. Right? So every marriage doesn't work out well. And a lot of the time when people get married, even though the divorce rate's fairly high, many people, of course, still stay married, around 50 to 55%, depending on what research you look at. but many of those people are in unhappy marriages. So what happens if somebody remains in an unhappy marriage? So we see that remaining in an unhappy marriage is negatively correlated with happiness, life satisfaction, self-esteem, and overall health, and positively correlated with mental health symptoms. So if somebody stays in a marriage when they're unhappy, it makes sense that they would have less happiness, but again, it also affects life satisfaction, self-esteem, and overall health. So that's fairly interesting. And that positive relationship with mental health symptoms is interesting as well. So unhappy marriages tend to be associated with a higher level of mental health symptoms. So in general, with unhappy marriages, with people who stay in those marriages, we see higher morbidity, meaning a higher frequency and severity of disorders, and higher mortality, so an increased risk of death. So the argument we hear around this idea is that, okay, remaining unhappily married comes with negative consequences, but divorcing must come with more severe consequences. And you could make a good argument for this, but if we look at the research, it actually indicates that remaining unhappily married may have more negative effects than divorcing. We see that this group, the group that stays unhappily married, is less happy than those who divorce and remarry, and less happy than those who divorce and do not remarry. Now, there are other variables to consider in this as well, of course. For example, age may play a part. When somebody marries earlier or later than they desired to, than they planned to in their life, this is actually associated with receiving fewer mental health benefits compared to never marrying. So even when considering all these other factors, of course, we still have this idea that people who are married are better off in many ways over those who don't. But this is where we get into the difference between correlation and causation. And actually, this is fairly interesting in terms of how marriage interacts with these other variables. For example, the prevailing theory is that in some sense, marriage causes happiness. So people are at a certain level, they get married, and they're happier or enjoy other benefits because of that. But there's actually evidence to suggest, for example, in the mental health realm, that people who have better mental health choose to get married. And when somebody's mental or physical health deteriorates, they're at a greater risk for divorce. So specifically, they're at a greater risk for having their partner leave them. So if somebody develops a mental disorder or that disorder becomes more severe, and the same thing with physical disorders, their partner is at a greater risk to abandon the marriage. We see people with a disability are 40% more likely to be divorced than those without a disability. And the greatest risk in this situation is for someone who has a disability that prevents them from working entirely. So they can't work full-time or part-time. So we see really two forces working here. People that are happier may be more likely to get married. And in a marriage, if one person develops a disability, mental, again, or physical, the partner tends to abandon them. So that kind of leaves marriage for really a smaller group of people that, of course, would appear to have higher scores across all these variables because of the selection process, both selecting in and selecting out. So it really emphasizes the need to kind of take these things apart and just not look at correlation. We really want to look at what variables cause other variables. And the way marriage interacts with these other variables is complex, and it doesn't necessarily point to marriage as kind of an answer for happiness, or even really having that strong an association with happiness. And when I use the word happiness here, I'm really generally referring to all these variables taken together. Mental health, physical health, sense of purpose, all that together when I talk about this construct of happiness. Now, one of these components of happiness, of course, is the economic benefit. And this seems to be fairly clear and logical. People who are married share resources, and this imparts benefits, right? So we see that if you live in a home and you invite another person to live with you, like in a marriage, you don't pay twice the rent, you don't pay twice the mortgage. The home doesn't cost more to heat or to cool. The property taxes don't change, at least in many areas. They're not affected. So these are just some examples of the economies of scale type benefits that we see with marriage. But that doesn't mean that there's a great economic picture for everybody. For example, we see that if a marriage ends in divorce, this can be financially disastrous, and often is. Wealth isn't split evenly. There's a cost in terms of like divorce attorneys and other costs. The divorce itself, for example, comes with a cost. We see alimony, child support is cost, and also lost wealth because every decision has to be made really too quickly. So the couple can't prepare their home properly for sale because they're in a hurry to get a divorce. They're not really going to look for the best prices for other property like automobiles, again, because they're in a rush. So just being forced to do something quickly can mean that wealth is lost in that process. Another interesting item we see from the research here is that individuals from a stronger economic background are more likely to marry. So marriage may not really cause wealth. To some extent, wealth may cause marriage. So let's take a look at another variable here that we see studied in relation to marriage, and this is loneliness. There's this idea that surely people who are married are not lonely, and people who are single must be lonely. But interestingly, married people tend to invest less time in other relationships, meaning other than the person they're married to. So friends, coworkers, family members. So it would appear they do have a stronger relationship with the one individual they're married to, but maybe weaker relationships with many other people, again, like friends and family, whereas people who are single do tend to invest energy in these other relationships. And of course, they're not married, so they don't invest any time in that relationship. So again, their time gets spread out across a wider number of people. So they have kind of a larger social network. But again, the person who's married has a very strong relationship, potentially, with the person they're married to. So you really have to kind of look at this carefully before saying that automatically people who are married are less lonely. Another theory that explains why we see these results that people who are married are better off in so many ways is that there does appear to be a temporary benefit. For example, we know that newlyweds are happier for a short time, but then they return to baseline. So again, looking at like happiness as a lot of variables, these variables tend to return to the point where they started. So there's like a period of euphoria. It's often called a honeymoon phase. And this can actually extend a little bit beyond just a few months or even a year. It can go for several years. But either way, it does appear to be time limited. Now, an interesting parallel here is that people who get divorced are actually unhappy for a short time, but they return to baseline as well. Now, another factor we have to look at is really the lifespan of marriage and how that ties to happiness. There is research that indicates that both men and women who are married become increasingly dissatisfied with marriage over time. Now, again, I mentioned studies before that differ from that in terms of findings, but we do see studies that support this theory as well, that dissatisfaction increases over time, and that women become dissatisfied with marriage sooner than men. When we look at divorces, we see that women initiate 70% of divorces. And after a divorce, a woman is less likely to remarry than a man, although part of this has to do with the sex ratio, so there are fewer men than women, but this doesn't explain this entire effect. So it does appear that women choose to not remarry more than men choose not to remarry after a divorce. Now, if we look at being single in general, women tend to be more satisfied with being single than men, although the difference is actually quite small. But the larger difference appears later in life. Women later in life tend to be much happier being single than do men who are later in life. So if we look at all this information, all these research articles, and we try to put it together, we see that in terms of happiness, marriage can lead to happiness, but being single can lead to happiness as well. And interestingly, again, looking at the research kind of from an overall perspective, we see that people who stay single and people who remain married are happier than people who divorce, regardless of whether or not the people who divorced remarried. So really, it's about consistency. Consistency seems to predict happiness better than inconsistency. So for men who want to remain uninvolved in terms of like getting involved in romantic relationships or marriage, whether they identify with that MGTOW movement or not, and for women who don't want to get involved in romantic relationships or marriage, I think you can build a rational argument against marriage. Now, again, I see a lot of benefits to being married, but there are downsides, and we see the same thing with being single. There are advantages and disadvantages. But I don't think it's a matter of one choice is inherently more rational than the other. I think that an individual needs to weigh the pros and cons and look at their other values and make the decision based on a lot of variables. So just like the construct of marriage overall, making the decision to be married or single is fairly complex. And one never knows what the other road would bring, right? So if somebody gets married, they don't know what would have happened if they stayed single, and the opposite is also true. So we look at time, it's linear, right? We go one way through time. We make decisions, and we don't ever really know for certain what would have happened if we made another decision. So we have to really look at these statistics and these studies and all these different variables and how they interact, and again, other values, and try to make the best decision we can. Now, of course, here I'm only looking at this one perspective, being married or being in a romantic relationship or not. I'm not looking at the other perspectives here that we see in the MGTOW philosophy like I talked about before, like separating oneself economically or physically from society or having an aversion to women. None of those different behaviors are supported by the research literature, right? I'm just looking at, does it make sense to not be married? Is it rational? Can one make a rational argument for that? That's different than hating an entire group of people or going off to live in some remote place, whatever. Those elements of the MGTOW philosophy, which again only exist for certain people who embrace that lifestyle, those elements are not well supported. But again, I did get a lot of comments from people who kind of distanced themselves from that hardcore MGTOW philosophy and really just said, look, this is just a rational calculation to avoid relationships. So if somebody's restricting the MGTOW philosophy to that, then again, yes, you can make a rational argument for avoiding relationships. Again, it comes down to personal value and personal choice. So I know whenever I talk about marriage and relationships and what decision kind of makes sense and the MGTOW philosophy or community, there are going to be a variety of opinions, people who agree with me and disagree with me. Please put those opinions in the comment section. They always generate a really interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this description of the rational case for and against marriage to be interesting. Thanks for watching.